to the Bet On Me podcast, the ultimate resource for softball players looking to take control of their training and reach their full potential. I'm your host, Krista Stoker, and on this show, we'll be discussing everything from taking a holistic approach to your training to data-driven strategies for maximizing and growing yourself, not only on the field, but off. At S2 Breakthrough, we believe that athletes should lead their own journey and push past any perceived ceilings on their talent. So join us as we explore the world of softball player development and help you bet on yourself. Because when you bet on yourself, you can't lose. We're back for another episode of Bet On Me, and I have Ashley here today. We wanted to just talk through some things. Obviously, this time of year for us, most of our high school athletes are in the middle of their high school seasons. And, you know, for us as a player development facility where we're trying to sort of encompass a lot of holistic concepts and thoughts, sometimes the high school season can be difficult for us and our athletes to navigate. And so we just wanted to kind of talk through some of the challenges that we've come up against, or our athletes have come up against, and talk through maybe some suggestions for solutions or some things that we've asked our athletes to do as they navigate that. So I'm going to kick it to you, Ashley, maybe to talk through, you know, one or two of the things that you've kind of seen come up, especially from a pitcher standpoint, just to kind of talk through some challenges that athletes have faced and maybe some ideas we've had, or maybe some places that we don't have the ideas yet of some ways that we can help them navigate this time of year.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think this is a time where we're feeling is even challenging for us to make sure that we're giving the right suggestions and advice to our athletes, because the circumstances can oftentimes just be so difficult and so extreme. So, you know, I would argue that for pitchers specifically, this is the most challenging time. There is, you know, maybe someone could argue catchers are sort of second in line, but the workload conversation specific to pitchers is really unique. And this is a time where, you know, I'm spending a lot of time with our athletes. They're not necessarily like training because they're playing so many games, but they are on the phone, on Zoom, depending on where they live, and asking for some advice. And how do I keep myself afloat during this time of year? We're seeing things like, you know, I have 6 games this week. I'm the only pitcher. I'm going to throw all of them. My team struggles to hit. I am often throwing, you know, back to back to back extra inning games. I threw 160 pitches on Monday just to come back and throw 140 on Tuesday. It's a tough one. It's really, really a tough one. So, you know, we are talking about things like, you know, are you able to get any off days? Is there a way, you know, sometimes we have athletes that they think that if that's an off day, should I be training on that day? And we're really trying to talk to them about, you know, making sure their caloric intake is where it needs to be, making sure that they're trying to really hold on to whatever rest recovery days they may have, talking to their coaches about workload potentially. Sometimes it's off the table for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's because their culture in high school is very much like, we don't ask for things like that. That's not a question. Oftentimes when I ask the question to a pitcher, could you sit down and say to your high school coach, you know, I'm starting to have some back pain. I'm starting to have some shoulder pain. Sometimes they laugh like, there's no way I could say that to them. That's not something that's, you know, there's no culture where the coach is open to conversation like that. And that's challenging. So then we're talking about things like, okay, you know, in between these 4 games a week that you're pitching, what are you doing at practice? And then, you know, we'll get feedback from some of the pitchers like, oh, well, I play shortstop because I'm the best athlete on the team, essentially. So then I throw overhand and I'm hitting. So we'll talk about, okay, can you talk to them maybe about, you know, lightening the workload in the other skills to really try to maximize some sense of, you know, rest and recovery in between games? Can you make sure that you're not pitching at practice, certainly not throwing live at practice? These are just conversations that they're tough. I'm sitting on the other end of the screen. Oftentimes I'm having these conversations. It's really tough to navigate. These kids are in such a tough position. And, you know, I think from my standpoint, what's really most difficult about it is sometimes this portrayal of the pitcher she's the leader. Oftentimes she's the captain. She is this like workload, like put the team on my back. And the concept of asking a pitcher to go to her coach and say, I need a break. I need a day off. Can I do less at practice is like shown or seen as weakness. And from my standpoint, it's really important to try to educate our S2 pitchers on like these kids are their souls are on fire for their teams. Like they are willing to throw through pain. They are willing to accomplish less as far as what they're working for in their the variability and their velocity and like ultimately these like performance metrics they're chasing because they're like, I don't want my team to think X of me. I think we just have to really like stop and stop putting these two worlds against each other. Like if you advocate for yourself, you're selfish, you're not a team player, you're not this like workhorse. It's simply not true. You can be both. The circumstances have become so extreme that our pitchers, they have to be able to advocate for themselves from, at least some ways. If it's not I need to pitch less in games, it has to at least be in this, what I'm doing between games. It has to be in some regard. They have to be able to talk about how they're feeling and what changes need to be made. It's tough because it often feels like it's in a world where the circumstances are so extreme. I often say I think it's abusive of what's being asked of them, and doesn't really feel like oftentimes there are adults doing their jobs to protect kids, because not to say that the adults around them are bad people, but the culture we've built in softball is as if workload doesn't matter, as if the grind and never speaking up for how your body feels is toughness. That's the way an athlete is supposed to be. And the reality is, I think that those concepts, while I believe in toughness, I believe in resiliency, I know how important it is to have a pitcher in the circle who's really, really mentally strong. We've put these two worlds against each other. It's like a concept of the past where workload was not the way it is now for these athletes. And it's just colliding and putting them in a really, really tough position.
I'm going to kind of go on that last piece because I think it's kind of important as we're having this conversation to set the stage, because I think high school is a challenging space, just in general, and especially in the context of what softball is now for a lot of these athletes. And I think, some things that are true about high school softball that are not true in the other spaces of these athletes are that you don't pick who's on your team necessarily. I mean, you have some choice, but it's about who lives in the areas that you live in. And so that obviously puts limits on choices that the coaches have for rosters and winning. And so we often see that there are situations where one or two kids are sort of make the team's ability to make it far into postseason, to win games, that type of thing. I think that the game quantity and practice schedule is obviously much different than most of these athletes are used to. Honestly, it's probably even heavier than a lot of college schedules with games and practices, and they're coming every day and they're doing those things. And so I think that environment made more sense and was easier to navigate. And maybe not, because workload, we didn't talk about it then, but it was easier or different to navigate when high school was it for these athletes. Your high school season was the thing that everyone was working towards. And now everyone comes out of their high school seasons and goes right into a grueling summer or fall, kind of depending on what time of year their high school season is, schedule. And so this isn't the piece of the puzzle that you're sort of prepping for. And I think we've lost sight of the fact that high school season should just be another season of development for most of these athletes. And it gets treated as, we often hear like the benefits of high school are that you get to compete for your community, you get to really try to win for the first time, you get to try to go into postseason, and all of those are amazing. But when you lose context of the puzzle that fits into, I think you sort of hit the worlds that we've hit now, which is yes, and this isn't the only thing for those athletes. And so coming into the season and assuming that we're just like, at the end we walk off, we win state, and then like we're all don't care what we did to the athletes in the process to get there. It's just not reality. They're young. They have to go to another season after that. And so that just, that structure is very challenging. And I've said to you, Ashley, that, I go to a lot of high school games to watch our athletes, and I don't want this to feel like just a kind of roast of the coaches, because I sat in the stands at a high school game where a pitcher that we know the 2 days before that had thrown over 100 pitches in 2 games back to back. And the coach made the decision not to throw her the day I was there, which is a good decision. It was a non-conference game. She rested her, and they lost kind of a lot. And I was in the stands listening to parents fired up about that decision against the coach of why didn't we throw that pitcher. And so I think there's just a lot of disconnect in what we're trying to accomplish here, and the ability to kind of get the adults in the room talking about the right goals, the right measuring sticks, and I think the final piece I'll say is it's definitely much worse for pitchers just from a workload standpoint. But another thing that I find comes up, because you have these like 1 or 2 kids that are kind of expected to carry these teams a lot of times, in some of these same games, I've listened to adults just say just negative things about kids who aren't living up to some sort of expectation, or who aren't holding the weight that they're supposed to be holding. And I just often feel like, wow, this is a lot that we're putting on 16-year-olds, 15-year-olds in this season to be able to manage a team. This isn't, it's hard enough for a 22-year-old on the biggest stage for the World Series to be talked about like that, but these are kids in their high school seasons. And so I think we got a lot of things colliding right now with how softball has changed overall, how, where high school fits into the puzzle, the conversations that we should be having about kids, the balance between toughness and advocating for yourself. And we're sort of, I would say we're in the middle of seeing that collide for all of our athletes, and they're trying to figure out how to navigate that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm like, in these conversations, I'm thinking, I'm talking to a 16, 17-year-old kid. Her heart is just, I mean, she's the ultimate competitor. And I'm saying, you need to go into your coach and to tell her you can't throw next week because your arm hurts. You have elbow pain. And she's like, I can't do it. And so it's like, I think to myself, before you get frustrated, Ash, would you have done that? Would you have done that? Knowing what it is like, they're like, that's my team. They are relying on me. It's a forfeit if I'm not out there, because I'm literally the only person. They have to then, it's not like, oh, the next pitcher isn't any good. It's like, no, there is no other pitcher. So the other person has to like slingshot it in there. So right. Would you have done that as a kid? And then I think to myself, no, you wouldn't, because when you're a teenager, you would do anything for your teammates. And so it's so tough, because it's like you really can't ask the kids to do it. They do it sometimes. Sometimes they get this fine line, and sometimes the circumstances they're in become so extreme that they know, like, I have no choice. I really have to work on this. But the adults around them have to open their eyes. And I by no means, we can't just ask the kids to stand up to the adults, because they're teenagers, right? And so they often are just seeing what's in the moment. But I am not trying to like pin that this is, I think the circumstances are a disaster. I want to be clear about that. I think the circumstances that I'm hearing pitchers are in during this time of year they're an absolute disaster. And I'm not trying to pin it on a certain person or it's the high school coach, it's the parents, it's this person. It's swirling. All of these variables are swirling around each other, but we at least need to recognize that it's a disaster. And I think like what we are seeing, I think especially because we collect so much data. So we see these athletes all winter long, all off season, build in velocity, report their health and wellness every day, really grow in the variability and how they move pitches, And they know these are my goals. This is what I've worked on. This is where I'm at leading into season. And so, we really try to emphasize tracking. We don't expect those variables to continue growing through season, but we want to make sure that we at least can keep them relatively stable, and certainly keep an eye on things like health and wellness. And so we are seeing just this overwhelming. This is not a pitcher or two. This is not if you live in Illinois where we are. It's all across the country. The overwhelming majority of pitchers are obviously velo cannot sustain because, like, newsflash, teenage athletes, teenage girls are not robots. They don't have a battery pack. They cannot sustain high intensity, full power day after day after day with the workload and the volume that they're being asked to throw. So velocity is having a hard time sustaining itself. We're watching oftentimes like a lot of their pitch profile that, again, this is just from my seat. These are kids that I just feel so connected to and invested in. So their pitch profiles are starting to then regress. They're becoming lesser versions of their maximized selves, that they really worked hard for. And then what I feel is the most important piece of their player development journey, they're hurting. Sometimes it's just excessive soreness, and it is just overall fatigue, but oftentimes it is back pain, it is forearm pain, it is tingling and numbness in their fingers. It is wild. And they are in these positions and they still don't feel like they can speak out against it. And so I guess I'm just at a point where, yes, this is not it's the coaches. I totally get it. It's the whole system. It's a lack of education, but the data is just sitting right in front of our faces. It's not only the reports and the subjective information that the athletes are giving us, but it's in our wellness questionnaires. It's in what we're seeing in velocity trends. It's in what we're seeing with their pitch profiles. And so then what? It's like, what is the solution? The athletes are like, okay, I finished my high school season. I have 1 week before it's travel ball. And I'm just kind of sitting in my seat like, what? The position that these pitchers are in, it's a lose-lose. If they ask for more time off, if they ask for some workload management to be applied in their high school seasons, if they ask for these things, they're seen as they're not a team player. They're selfish. They're weak. And so what they have to do is sacrifice themselves. What we're asking them to do is sacrifice their performance in the long run. We're asking them to sacrifice their bodies, forget just pitching, but just as a young woman, sacrifice your body to then go right into the summer season, where then at the end of that, then the high school coach is like, okay, we won state maybe. Yes, right? That is all good. But then, as you're saying, that's only a piece of the puzzle. Now, in 1 week, that pitcher is now being asked by her travel ball coach to perform on a national stage because now XYZ University is there to recruit her. And she is a fraction of herself. I guess from my standpoint, I'm just getting really stuck in okay, if we have to break this barrier, yes, there has to be education on how to get this puzzle to look a little bit more in favor of the athlete as a whole, not just in a single season, but in her entire, this entire puzzle of all the seasons that are connecting with one another. But at the very least, I think the seat that we're sitting in, what we're trying to do is to really figure out how to break down this wall of advocating yourself is a must in these current circumstances. Everything is stacked up against you. So advocating is a must. So figuring out how to navigate advocating for yourself and not seeing that as weak, as selfish, as not a good captain leader, breaking down that off days are for the week. It's just I always think, would we say that to baseball players? Would we say that to pitchers? If we asked baseball players to pitch every single day?
The answer is yes in some circumstances. So I don't know that that's a different culture. I think I guess I'm asking okay, think about professional levels. We know, okay, when we're talking about maximizing performance, it's that goes away. This is the seat we're sitting in. We're working with our athletes in the off season to maximize performance. But the entire culture, even though we're going to ask for max performance, there is nothing about their surroundings that is promoting maximizing performance. So what I'm getting at with this baseball concept is when we are looking at professional athletes and we know
we're measuring their
Professional.
performance.
I'm saying high school versus high school because I went to
Sure.
first week of followed the very first game of the high school season, and a pitcher threw over 100 pitches in baseball. So
right, but it's like we know on the largest stages, Krista, that like, oh, we can't run those guys into the ground. They're not going to perform the way we want. But if they're kids,
on the largest stages in softball,
no, probably not.
Right. So I think what you're asking people to infer is challenging because that doesn't,
right.
You know, we watch similar things happen. Oh, someone has a no-hitter going, so we're going to let her go infinitely, even though her team doesn't hit. And we know, you know, I've said to you, if the circumstance, and this is at the NCAA level, the top, you know, power 5 level, you know that it doesn't matter in MLB if it doesn't matter if the pitcher has a perfect game. If he crosses his workload threshold, he's coming out. You know, I mean, we've seen things like that happen, and that doesn't happen in softball. So then, like now we're a tier under that, and we have volunteer coaches and many standpoint teachers. You know, people that are stepping into these roles who don't have that level of education. And my brain, as you were talking, was going to the administration. Because I think that when you think of all of the actors and you're thinking, okay, who's got the power here? You know, the people that really have the power in the high school situations are the administration, you know, whether that's the athletic director in that high school, the school board in that district, you know, there are people who have authority. And I think there is some argument at the very highest levels of NCAA that maybe there's too little emphasis on winning for some of the softball programs. But in high school, it's like your measuring stick of these coaches is not winning. It's not winning. And if that's what we are measuring coaches who are not being paid much, if anything, who are teachers or, you know, otherwise involved in the community as their actual full-time job. And then what we're measuring them by is winning or lack of parent complaints. You know, I think that's kind of administratively what we look at. Then we've sort of created this adults going against each other in a way where the kids are just destined to drown under there. You know, I think we've set it up in a way where what we're measuring things against is challenging. And this is a conversation I have to have daily and still struggle with at the travel ball level that I coach in, which is to say, like, my measuring stick as a coach is not winning. It doesn't mean we're not trying to win, but that is not the measuring stick, because you can't do that and have a layer of development of the players, as people, because there will be times where you make decisions that are in the best interest of development that probably cause you to lose, you know, and those sometimes are contradictory to each other. And so, you know, I go to kind of, as you're talking of, like, who is the person who has the power here and who we're kind of asking to make some changes. And I think I would just challenge administrations to think about the whole context that these athletes are in, and how are we going to measure this high school bubble, and how am I going to support that coach in those decisions, and what am I asking of those coach, and what hopefully we're asking of that coach is make a healthy environment, make it about development, teach them how to compete, you know, in the right ways, when, you know, and not in the, like, compete through pain ways. And that's it. That's the measuring stick. And if a parent comes and says, you know, I was really pissed he didn't throw our number one and we lost this game, that's really on the administration to say, like, we support that coach in that decision, because that's how we're measuring it. And so I think there's a lot of people we're asking to make some decisions, but the ultimate sort of checkpoint is at that administration level, and thinking of how we measure that, and how do we put parameters on, you know, it goes all the way in Illinois to something like an IHSA, the people who make the rules. What are the parameters for, we have a parameter that you can't play when it's this temperature, but what are the parameters? What we deal with in Illinois is the weather is bad at the beginning. So then all of a sudden, or at least in Chicago area. So then all of a sudden now we have to make up these games. So we have 7 games in 5 days. Should that be allowed? And is it the coach's responsibility to navigate that, or should that be in the rules?
Yeah, and there's one pitcher on the team. I mean, like, seriously,
Right.
these
And
are the circumstances we're hearing about.
These are the conversations that should be happening at the highest level. So I think if we all just got a little more curious and said, what are the things we can all come together and agree on? And let's put some parameters around that, because it's not right to put it all on the coaches who, like, the high school coaches can't go get all of this education and know workload and know all of these things. They can't do all of it by themselves. So we can ask them to do more. We can ask them to listen to their athletes, but then there has to be okay, if I'm going to do that, I need to feel supported by the administration. And the administration's like, well, if I'm going to do that, the rules need to support it. And those are the conversations we all need to be happening. It's the same thing that I say, you don't run into quite the challenges in travel, but it's the same thing I always say in travel is, if we're going to start questioning a coach for, this stuff happens in travel ball too. You'd have a athlete. She's the only one that's going to have that high level team win. And I watched it all summer. She threw, at the very end of the year, we faced a team that threw a kid 21 back-to-back innings. And I think we got to get curious about that. Why did the coach make that decision? Why did the parent allow them to make that decision? Why did the college coaches watch that athlete and not say anything? Why isn't there a rule in the governing body forbidding decisions like that? So I think it's really starting to ask the right questions. And if we're going to ask the athletes to advocate and be curious in that way, then I think the least we can do is ask that, the adults to also start to ask some questions, and not necessarily in an attacking way of each other, but to really just listen to each other and think of some solutions that put the kids first.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I think, like, my ask of this game right now is for the high school level, the travel ball level, the college level, to get out of their silos and to start seeing the entirety of the puzzle that these athletes are in. Because, like, I'm sure if you asked most college coaches, they think like high school coaches are out of their minds, because of what they're doing. And
or travel ball is X, or the parents.
Yes.
X, everyone's just pointing fingers.
For sure. And so I'm like, okay, but in reality, like, the number of times that maybe I had conversation with a college coach who's like, I went to see, XYZ pitcher and she was only throwing blank velocity. I'm like, I want to jump through the window. Like, what do you want from her? Like, she literally got thrown, every high school game the next weekend started travel ball, where, as you know, that schedule is insanity. Like, there are multiple games in a day. And then the college coach is like, yeah, I don't know. I thought she was throwing harder. It's just like, there's such a disconnect in understanding what these athletes are being asked to do. And one, we could obviously go all the way back that we think someone could sustain 65 miles per hour. The athletes that are sustaining 65 miles per hour really probably throw 70, right? So, like, they have dropped to 65. Yeah. Yes. And so the athletes who are throwing 65 have now dropped to 59 when they're in a system like this. So it's like, those things get frustrating where there seems to be this disconnect, or like my travel ball coach is like, he's mad because I'm not hitting my spots, or I'm not doing this. I'm like, this athlete is so exhausted. So what my ask is for all of us to get out of the silo and to see. Now, obviously, we're in this unique position where, like, you're in a different spot because you also coach travel ball. But from my standpoint, I'm like, I don't have to ever win a game. Like, there's no games to break through. So I get we're in this unique circumstance and that I see it from different eyes. But so I only see it through the athlete's eyes. But honestly, I feel like that's what's been so empowering. We are watching the entire journey and helping them navigate their journey and the game, practice, workload schedule as a whole. And that is so eye-opening to, like, wow, I see how you get sucked into just your silo when you're in it. But it just, like, what are we asking of these athletes? We talk to coaches all the time. And when we hear things like, about this generation of athletes and they don't understand how to work hard and they don't understand, I'm not saying coaches are lying. And I know that S2 does not have every athlete in the country. I do not see that in this generation of athletes. I see athletes who are exhausted, who are being worked to death, but who have their soul is on fire to achieve their goals. And so I simply don't see, and again, doesn't mean that, again, we don't have every athlete in the whole country at S2, but I see a very hungry generation of athlete. I have seen just a culture and a system that is so unforgiving and has absolutely driven these athletes into the ground. And we're asking them totally, to achieve things that are totally unrealistic, that are their bodies simply cannot sustain. And then we're like, if you ask for off days, if you say your arm hurts, it's like, you're not as tough as pitchers used to be 20 years ago. I'm like, what I would like to say is that I believe that this generation of athletes, I believe their souls are on fire. And just because they're not willing to throw 5 games in a row, 4 games in a day, does not mean they are weak. They are competitors. They are leaders. They are tough. They are strong. But they also, in order to be all of those things, know what they need to achieve. And so they are also committed to staying on a journey and a track to stay in line with those goals. And there's nothing wrong with that. So my ask is that the coaches as a whole, we all, and families, parents, we get on the same page with understanding where they are in their entire journey. And in the meantime, I'm like shouting from the top of my lungs, athletes, pitchers, obviously, or the athletes that I'm talking to, you are incredibly dedicated, committed, strong. You are the ultimate leader on your team and can advocate and take care of yourself. And so we have to just, and I feel like my role is to just keep, again, it's not like complaining, pointing fingers, but just keep feeding that information from the inside to these athletes to help those conversations keep rolling.
Yeah. I just to kind of summarize that, I was thinking of some of my own journeys through this, because I do coach a team, and I think it's important being able to advocate for yourself, set boundaries, sort of take criticism at face value is what you need to be healthy. And it's what you need to be a healthy individual who can then go with a camera on them on ESPN and, strike someone out in a clutch moment, hit a home run in a clutch moment. Like, those things are related. And I think, to be perfectly honest, I think there are coaches, unfortunately, adults who don't have those traits, who haven't worked through that in themselves. And I think one of my biggest growths as a coach has come in sort of doing those things for myself first, so that I was in a position where I could help the athletes navigate those. And I didn't see those things as weaknesses. And so, I think that there are moments where we're asking an athlete to be tough, but we are making a decision against the best interest of the athlete because we are not tough enough to handle the ramifications of that choice. And I think, I think back to times where, of a time where I made the decision to sit our best pitcher for an entire weekend because of where she was pain wise. And we played and lost horribly. I mean, the results were not good. And it was really not a great place or space to be in as a coach, because we aren't at a place yet where people understand things like that. And I think what I saw about it is like, this is the time for me as the adult and me as the coach to show the athlete that, like, I will shield you from this because I want you to be able to advocate for yourself, do what's in your best interest when you need to do what's in your best interest for your health, for your performance, and feel like for once there is an adult shielding me in this. And so I think the other thing is just for the adults too, you have to be in a space where you can take that. And if you aren't in a space, if you're making decisions because you're nervous about the backlash that's going to come from the stands or from, whatever it is, from social media, from whatever, then you got to really do some work. You got to do some work to put yourself in a place where, as the adult, you can take that. Doesn't mean it's easy, but if you're going to ask the kids to be doing challenging, hard things, then you've got to be in a situation where you can do the same. And so I often think all of my worst decision as a coach I can tie almost all of them back to fear of the ramifications and an inability to be in a spot where I felt like I could manage that. And so I just think also that the adults have to do the work. You got to do the work. And if you're going to be in a position where you are raising a child, helping raise a child as a coach, being the administration, looking over children, whatever it is, and you're in that space, then you better have done the work to be in a position where you can truly be their advocate and protect them in this space if they need to come and advocate for themselves. And so I think that there's, aside from us all being curious and talking to each other and really doing that, it's like, and when we make those decisions, we feel like we personally are in a space to be able to navigate that.
Because it's way easier to throw the athlete, her health, well-being under the bus. I mean, that is way easier. And then say they're not tough. I mean, it's like, that's a way easier route. And unfortunately, it's the route we often see. And I get it. It's human nature. This is really difficult stuff to navigate. But yeah, it's way easier. Throw the athlete under the bus. When she doesn't perform, it's on her. It's a very complicated conversation. I think before we jumped on this,
let's start having it.
Right.
I mean, before
we jumped on this call, we're like, our goal of this is not to like point fingers at anyone. It's to just bring to light the layers of complications to this story, and to make sure that like the athletes, like, we see you, we hear you, and I think like I don't ever feel like I'm linked to the coaches. I mean, that's too, I'm like, we are for the athletes. We work with coaches. We are trying to obviously deploy player development concepts and training strategies to coaches to get to athletes. But like, my soul on a daily basis is connected to the advocacy of the athletes. And so we have to get on these channels and these forums and talk in a way that is pushing boundaries, because if we're going to do that, if we say we're for the athletes, then we need to bring things like this up. So I totally agree. Having these conversations, bringing it to light, knowing that no one is totally innocent, no one is to blame, and to keep letting the athletes know, like, we see you, we hear you, and we're going to keep coaching you through how to navigate a world that we don't even know how to navigate ourselves.
Totally. All right. Well, we'll leave it there. And if anyone wants to come on and have more of this conversation, high school coaches, administration, college coaches, you're more than welcome. But we'll just keep pushing it forward and letting athletes know we're here for them, and see if we can keep making some progress for them. So thanks for talking, and until next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Well, S2 Nation, thanks for joining another episode of the Bet on Me podcast. Go out today, bet on yourself, and remember, when you bet on yourself, you can't lose.